And what you learn is when you grow through trauma, on the other side of it is a river to another side you've never ever been able to explore. If you stay within the places where you've been hurt the most and you only believe the stories that you tell yourself, you'll never be able to grow.
Welcome to the Authentic Man podcast. I am your host, David Chambers. This is a podcast for men who want more and less from life. More deep connection, more emotional intelligence, more self-awareness, and more great sex. And less heartache, less conflict, less overthinking, and less stress. Creating dating lives, sex lives, and relationships that are incredible and authentic. My deepest goal is that you, the listener, can take away what you hear in this podcast and apply it to your life so that you can experience greater happiness, transformational growth, deeper relationships, and profound sexual intimacy. I believe that as men, we are capable of so much more depth than we are shown or led to believe. So join me as we get deep into this. Welcome back, listeners. And today I have an incredible conversation that weaves and dances across all the things that I think are incredibly important, right, to us. The main conversation is really around OCD and intrusive thoughts and dealing with that, finding powerful ways to deal with that, and also looking at some of the misconceptions about OCD as well. I've got a wonderful guest here, Shaun Flores, who is a multidisciplinary creative, mental health advocate, and as he will say himself, is a professional agitator, trying to change narratives around men and various mental health issues that he has dealt with personally. In this episode, he really talks about his battle with OCD and how it led him to intrusive thoughts and then even thoughts of suicide and rape. It's a really powerful conversation, right? Especially if you're dealing with OCD or you know someone that is, you're going to have a real deeper understanding of like how it is. And also you're going to have a bit more compassion, because I think sometimes we trivialize OCD, thinking it's just something petty and silly and people should just, think differently. But as I often say, like, we all have stories that we are adhering to that are not true. And often we are not sure that they're not true, or we don't know that they're not true. So it's a really, really incredible conversation. We dance with some stuff around masculinity and OCD and just masculinity in general. Men being disadvantaged as well in society. I was really blown away by the conversation and all the different things we talked about. But we also talk about psychedelics and how they helped Shaun himself. He's been part of a trial, and how they helped him with his OCD, which I think is a really powerful conversation. And inside that, when I talk about psychedelics, I always recommend that people, especially if you're suffering from mental health issues, you should in particularly make sure you find a licensed therapist or trial or professional of some type. There's some in the UK. I know someone in the Netherlands as well who professionally work with people with psychedelics. It's always important to do that, not just to do them alone, especially if you're suffering from a mental health issue. So enough from me. You don't need to know anything from me. Just jump into this episode. Hello, wonderful listeners. Great to have you back on another fantastic episode. I'm very much looking forward to this because this is a topic that mainly I don't know much about, actually. So I'm here to learn like you are, because I think it's an incredibly important topic and something that is deeply misunderstood, and often something is a big taboo and people feel a level of shame and so forth around it. And really, we're going to talk about OCD. And I've got Shaun here, wonderful man. We've known each other a little while. It'd be amazing for you to introduce yourself and, talk about what it is you do, because you do so many different things of yourself. It's incredible.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come on and to speak on your podcast. I value a lot of the work that you do. It's a reflection and a mirror back to a lot of the individual and the man that I want to be most importantly. And yeah, we met, where was it? At Manual, but Manual hasn't really done much for any sort of men's health in any way, shape or form, but that's a conversation for another day. Yeah, I would describe myself as a a professional agitator and a legal harasser. That's quite often how I describe myself. I'm always trying to agitate the public, trying to make change in society. But really and truly, a public speaker, mental health advocate, podcaster, but I haven't done a podcast in a while since my big mental health breakdown as a result of OCD. And so mental health advocate, public speaker, freelance journalist, creative. Sometimes I actually really don't even know how to describe myself. I think just creative would be the best way to describe what I do. I try to take a lot of my life experience and to put it out in the work that I do to really give an authentic and a true voice to those who don't often have an opportunity to really speak.
Yeah, beautiful. I really resonate with that. And I think you're also doing yourself a misjustice, because I know that there's modeling in there that you've done. Yeah. Like you said, there's a journalism, there's writing. You've been on TED twice, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, funnily enough, I'm working on my third piece now. So I'm working on the psychedelic revolution that will be coming, which will potentially change how we see mental health. So I was on a trial with Imperial College London looking at the therapeutic capabilities of psilocybin, so the psychoactive ingredient in magic mushrooms, and how it really helps to reduce OCD symptoms, but in general, how psychedelics are leading the way for us to really change the way we see mental health.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I had no idea you were on the trial, because I've been kind of following a lot of the information around psychedelics just from a personal interest point of view. You know, I've done multiple ayahuasca journeys. I've done some mushroom journeys myself, just for wisdom, really, more than anything. But I've also known people who have suffered from depression as self-medicated, which I don't necessarily recommend. But they have seen some massive, massive benefits from using psilocybin and mushrooms and so forth.
Yeah, I would love to try ayahuasca, DMT, LSD, ketamine, MDMA. I would love to try all of these in therapeutic settings. You're right that I don't necessarily have an issue of self-medicating. I think ultimately people sometimes know themselves better than anyone else can, but I think you have to be very careful about the setting and the environment that you do it in. I think that's a very key point for people to take away, and it's a caveat essentially that often we do things recreationally, which yes, can garner a lot of fun. We can have a fantastic time with it. But I believe ultimately if you want to get to the depths and the roots of where your mind sits and lays, doing it in a therapeutic setting with therapists around you, a peace of mind, you're quiet and just searching deep inside of your mind, it's very important to do it in a controlled manner, I would say. And from my opinion and being on the trial, doing psychedelics in a controlled manner had a profound effect. I've done psychedelics before that. I've only really done mushrooms. And I did 3 grams at the time when I was recreationally with my friends. And it was a fantastic experience. I can never really explain psychedelics to people unless you've really tried psychedelics. I think it's one of those things you can't ever, words can only really explain to a certain degree. So, yeah.
Incredible. I'm sure we'll circle back round to that a little bit later on. But I'd love to ask you a question. I asked all my guests was like, what was your journey to do the work that you do now, especially bearing in mind that there's, you have so many different strands and a professional agitator. I love that. I can imagine that on a business card.
Yeah. No, it's true. I think change maker's great, advocate's great, but professional agitator, I think is the one that excites me the most. It's a bit in touch with my disturbing personality where I like to really change the way we think and to really unraveled even the way that I think about certain things. So I would say last year I had a really big mental health breakdown as a result of intrusive obsessive thoughts, which I later found out was OCD. But so what happened last year was I was diagnosed with OCD. I tore my ACL, MCL, meniscus and fractured my leg in football. Ended up in hospital for 3 days with pneumonia. Then my auntie died. My cousin was murdered. My half brother died. So last year was a really big awakening and I think I wasn't really sure if I was going to make it through everything that happened last year, but that's what happened. And then during my recovery with OCD, which was still incredibly hard at the time, and I'm still in recovery now, so I still have the thoughts, I just learn how to live with them. And a lot of people have this idea that OCD is all about cleaning and symmetry. OCD manifests itself through clean and symmetry, and those are just two themes. Whereas for someone like myself, I live with something called pure O, which is not a scientific term, but it means purely obsessional, which means everything that I live with is all in my mind. You can't see it outwardly. It's nothing that you understand from the outward. It's what I know, what I know internally. And I was living with sexual orientation OCD and harm OCD, which were my two main themes. So sexual orientation OCD is the fear and the obsession that I potentially am gay or I don't know my sexuality. And the other one was harm OCD, which is the idea I could harm myself and harm other people. Now, when I look back further at my journey, I realized I was probably suffering with very obsessive compulsive tendencies before that for years. When I was in the modeling industry, I used to starve myself to achieve cheekbones at the time, because cheekbones was almost this idea of beauty. And when I was doing fashion modeling in particular, the slimmer you were and the more gaunt your face was looking, the more work I was able to get. And I was positively affirmed by all the people around me. And what I realized actually is eating disorders, it's an undiagnosed eating disorder, but eating disorders are on the obsessive compulsive scale, actually, funnily enough. So they all operate within the same region of the brain. Now, modeling gave me a lot of opportunities that I'm massively grateful for. I've been able to model for brands, meet people, have connections, but I went into the modeling industry a little boy, and I came out of it with scars that made me a man, I think is the best way to describe it. I went on to do journalism. I studied an NCTJ, which I still actually am yet to pass, because, again, for years I didn't realize I was going through a lot of obsessive, intrusive thoughts, so I need to get back to that. I'm currently training to be a life coach, funnily enough, at the moment, and I want to go on to try and become a therapist and work with people with anxiety disorders. So, yeah, modeling, I was scouted at the time. And then also what happened with journalism was I started the NCTJ. I was doing freelance writing every now and then, unpaid, voluntary. And ever since recovering from my mental health breakdown, now I've started writing a lot more about my story and exploring different concepts within manhood, masculinity, society, politics. Public speaking wise as well. I delivered my first TED Talk in 2018, which was technically supposed to be on the failures of the education system, but it was wrongly titled as the failures of multiculturalism. I did my second one in 2022 last year, which was on masculinity and the straitjacket of masculinity. So I've been lucky to be able to have the opportunities that I've had, but a lot of them have come as a result of my lived experience, but also the research and a lot of the work that I've done, which have led me and put me into the place of where I am now.
Wow. What a breadth and depth of experience of living, you know. I always, years ago, I went to a wedding once and I was talking to an ex-girlfriend's friend and I was telling her about all my travels and all the things that I'd done. And she turned to my ex-girlfriend at the time and went, "Is he fucking lying?" And my girlfriend at the time was like, "No, like that's what he's done with his life." And it's like, hearing all this from you, I can imagine some people be like, wow, how does one man fit so many things into living, into this, like the years of that you've been on the earth? So I'll just acknowledge you really for like really grabbing life and living life fully as you can.
Absolutely. I'm thankful that you said that actually as well. And it's great to be in the company of somebody else who also tries to do as much as they can, because you miss 100% of the shots you never take. And I'd rather try things than to not try them at all. And a lot of my life growing up was, I thought that I knew what I wanted to be and I thought I knew where I was going to go. I went to school, thought I was going to go to uni, get the 9-to-5 job. But when I went to uni and I realized a lot of the things I didn't want to do, a lot of the things that I thought I was going to do, I actually really didn't want to do. So I wanted to explore and figure things out and to be able to understand what is it that I really wanted to do. But this is why I think a lot of my experiences have brought me into the coaching / therapy space, which I believe is ultimately where I want to be. But to use all of my communicative skills and to use my public speaking, my writing, my research skills, I don't believe I can be narrowed down to one thing, but I would like to master something at some point. And through the experiences, I've learned so much. If I had stayed away and I cowered from the limelight, or I had stayed away and not wanted to try things, I would not be the individual that I am today. And I'm sure you probably know this as well yourself, David, that it's only through trying can you really discover yourself. If you're always in the comfort zone, you never get to that learning zone. And that's something I'm learning a lot in coaching, that I've had to take the stepping stones to go and learn something, to try something, to reinvent myself all the time, to reinvent that wheel. And it's those experiences that have really informed me to become the individual that I am today. And it wasn't always the easiest. Potentially, funnily enough, my therapist believes that I have some sort of ADHD, which is probably why I've been able to have a breadth of experiences, because dopamine can be quite hard to get for people with ADHD, executive dysfunction, and so much more. But the experiences that I've had have really had a profound effect on the way I see the world and the people I've met, the experiences I've had, and it's landed me even here today to be able to have a conversation with you.
And there's just this, what I sense as well, is like a boldness for moving forward. Like, you know, I can definitely see, like I've been coaching for a number of years, but I also see it myself that sometimes like an opportunity comes up and there's this me that goes, oh, am I good enough? Am I going to be shamed? Is there going to be something wrong? And it's very easy to stand back and take a couple steps back and procrastinating in some way, dysfunctionally destroy the opportunity. But I'm really getting the sense, like I felt almost physical sense from you. It's like when these opportunities come, your natural instinct or the instinct that you've learned is to lean into them, to like go, yeah, let's do this. Let's make this happen.
Funnily enough, you're right, because last night I saw an Evening Standard Stories competition and they were looking for stories about belonging. So I just went, let's see what my stream of consciousness brings up. And I just typed it out and I sent off the application there and then. That's my mentality of a lot of different things, because again, I say to people, you're right. A lot of the time we don't feel like we're good enough. And this is how I felt quite often about committing myself to full-time jobs, or committing myself sometimes to being the best version of myself, which I'm learning through being coached in life coaching. Working on yourself really is a constant thing. It is not something that stops. So I push myself boldly to things because I also looked at my background, I looked at my environment, and I realized, so when my dad died on Christmas Day when I was 6 years old, and my mum went through severe depression for about 6 months. It was really bad. And my mum's world was never the same. Growing up, my mum was never the same person. She cowered away, became really anxious, was worried about things. And I said, I'm not going to be like that. I'm going to go and keep trying things. And understandably, trauma affects us all differently. But I think from seeing the way my mom was profoundly affected by my dad's death, I said, I need to try things in this life. And I'm not perfect. And there's still things I'm still afraid of. I'm afraid to travel by myself. So I actually really want to go and travel by myself to a certain place and just trust and believe in the process. But the reason why I am the way I am is ultimately because I saw what happened when you don't do things. You just become the same person all the time. You don't open yourself up to new experiences, new people. You don't change. You don't learn. You just have no chance to self-improve. And a lot of what I want to do is self-improve. I can't be perfect. I let go of the idea of being perfect a very long time ago, but I just want to be able to be the best version of myself, or the close enough to the best version of myself, which I think allows me to be the better version, allows me to give my best to the world. And that's my mentality, to leave the world in a better place than I found it. And through your work as well, I can clearly see that you want to give your best to the world.
Yeah. One of my philosophies, and I think this probably matches what you're saying there, is like my purpose on this earth is to evolve my bloodline and to evolve the human race forward in whatever way that my gifts and talents allow me to do that. And I see that as when I look at myself from that point of view, taking on the new things and taking on the challenges and facing difficult conversations, even if it's a difficult conversation with my partner about something, right? I look and go, wow, my dad couldn't probably have this conversation, but I'm willing to step into the uncomfortable space of having this conversation now. And it's like how I can move my whole being forward so that if the day comes that I have children, that I equip them to take that baton and take that further than I was able to take it. Absolutely.
Ultimately, I think a parent's role in this world is to raise a child in a way that they can make the world a better place, but raise a child so that they can live without them as well. That's ultimately the role. It can be quite a bittersweet one. But you're right, to evolve is a constant practice. And I think, especially as men, the burden of performance is on us. We are forced to self-improve. Life doesn't really afford us any sort of liberties to not self-improve. And this is why I think even the conversations with the red pill and the blue pill movement and feminism and men's right, there's some truths that are quite self-evident within that space, that men, we have to self-evolve. We have to evolve. We have to self-improve to be the best versions of ourselves. But we know that masculinity, for example, in and of itself is not toxic. We know strong men leave the world in a better place, but men who don't feel like they have any value to society are probably more toxic in the sense of they're the ones who shoot up schools, they kill themselves, they feel like they have no hope. And a lot of the work I even want to do is to give men a chance to see their value and to see how much they are needed in society. Because I was at a place before where I was badly suicidal as a result of my mental health, and I'm very grateful for still being alive to this very day. So my bloodline eventually will be able to live on when I have it.
Beautiful. Wow, really touched me there, like what you ended with. Let's jump into a little bit around the OCD, which I know you're very passionate about. And I guess the first question is, what is OCD? Because I think it's one of those things that's really misunderstood by people.
Yeah, so OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder, which is an anxiety/compulsive disorder. So the best way to describe it is everyone has intrusive thoughts. So what happens is an individual with OCD has intrusive thoughts. They do certain behaviors, which we know as compulsions. So the thoughts are known as obsessions. The behaviors are known as compulsions. And what you do as a result to alleviate the anxiety that the thoughts have given you is you behave in a certain kind of way. So for someone with cleaning or symmetry OCD, they might clean erratically when they have an intrusive thought because it's what alleviates the anxiety. But what happens within the OCD cycle is every time you're anxious and you teach your brain, okay, I have a thought, I'm anxious, let me do something. You're teaching your brain it's something for you to pay attention to. You're teaching your brain you need to be worried. And what happens is the OCD cycle gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and your world gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, I think a very important distinction to make is everybody has anxiety. Everybody gets anxious about things. Everybody can have a changing of emotions. The difference between anxiety and an anxiety disorder is anxiety, you can still operate through it. Anxiety disorders make your world far smaller. It's disordered anxiety. It's anxiety that is probably somewhat very different to the quote-unquote normal understanding or the metric that we have to understand what is normal in society. So for me, when I was having thoughts that I was gay, I had thoughts that I was going to harm people, I had thoughts I was suicidal, it shut my world off. I didn't want to go outside. I became very badly depressed as a result of it. That's classic OCD. And for a lot of people, our views on OCD come from Channel 4, 2013, Obsessive Compulsive Cleaners. And everyone has this idea, simply because of the media, that that's the only way OCD presents itself. So with a lot of the work that I do, it's about trying to change the perceptions and the ideas and the assumptions on what OCD is, because it's a very misunderstood mental illness. Also, there's a slight insidious belief that it's a white man's disease and black people and other ethnic minorities don't get it. But also, most importantly, that it's a treatable and a recoverable mental illness. But it can be incredibly debilitating. There's a lot of people that have taken their lives as a result of OCD. There's a lot of people who can't live and function in society because of OCD. It's not a joke in the way that we seem to understand it to be.
And it's
I'm just getting my charger.
You were talking there about
Yes, I'm still here.
That's okay.
Let me just get this charger because this laptop dies really quickly. Perfect. Right, there we go. Yes.
Yeah. That you talked about OCD and sexuality, because I've actually spoken to a number of men who I've worked with coaching wise that had this concern. Their OCD was like intrusive thoughts about being homosexual, and this really hurt them in terms of like building relationships, spending time with friends, spending time with family, even spending time with children for some of them as well. Like, I'd love to hear more about how that part of your OCD affected you.
So what happened for me was I was having intrusive thoughts about my sexuality. I had a dream, and in this dream I saw the back of a white guy, and I woke up with just sudden belief I was gay. Nobody could tell me any different. That was my new identity. But it still didn't sit with me. I threw up in the toilet the same morning. Whenever I had to go to photo shoots and I was around gay people, I would sit there and obsess, ruminate, think, am I gay? I needed to have evidence to prove that I was gay. I needed to do things to almost prove that I was gay. It affected my sexual life as well. Any kind of engagement with a woman, I'd be a bit like, how am I able to have an erection if I'm supposed to be gay? It was a constant back and forth. And that's what anxiety is. You're ruminating, you're chewing over the cud over and over again. Overthinking does not ever take you any closer to the solution for a problem. It never does. This is something people need to really realize. But I avoided my gay friends. When I was getting a lot of male attention as a result of the fashion modeling I was doing, I remember I'd have thoughts a bit like, they're noticing things about me that I'm not noticing about myself. That means they must know that I'm somehow must be gay. So I was trying to, again, find evidence, prove that I was gay. I was looking for reassurance from my gay friends in the sense of I'd ask them, bro, I think I'm gay. And some of my gay friends would be like, Shaun, you're not gay, man. Like, everyone knows you're not. But I'm like, how do you know? Are you sure? I was like, and you pick up, but this is what I mean. It becomes an endless cycle. And then for what happened for me, which was the penultimate moment before my breakdown, was I was with one of my female friends, and the word rape popped into my head, and I became terrified, absolutely terrified. I had a huge panic attack because for me, I thought to have the word rape in my head meant that I was a rapist, meant that I was a danger to her, a danger to myself, a danger to society. So I remember I screamed at her to leave. And a lot of people with OCD, harm OCD in particular, these are thoughts they live with, but they don't say it because there's a fear of judgment. There's shame, guilt, and embarrassment. And what I realized was we lose too many men as a result of that for thoughts that are not their fault and they're not their problem. So with OCD, the intrusive thoughts are ego dystonic, which means they are against your morals and values. Whereas thoughts that are ego syntonic, they align with your morals and values. So for someone with OCD, they live a lot more with ego dystonic thoughts than the average person ever will. So having all of these thoughts, I went to therapy, and therapy made it worse. I saw a psychodynamic therapist, and psychodynamic therapy is obviously you're trying to get to the root of the thoughts, whereas for something like OCD, you don't try to get to the root of the thoughts. They are ego dystonic by nature. Your brain creates fantastical stories all the time. Your brain is a storytelling machine. You cannot believe everything your brain tells you, because if you do, you'll be run amok, led astray, bamboozled, hoodwinked, as Malcolm X, as Denzel Washington said in the Malcolm X speech. Actually, it's one of my favorite speeches. But what happened after that was, my really big breakdown was when I had suicidal OCD, which was the fear that I was going to kill myself. I was terrified that I was going to take my life. So I called all my friends, told them I was massively depressed and suicidal. And they were crying because they didn't know how to help me. I was usually the guy in the group that was the strong one. I was the leader. I was who everybody came to when they needed advice. And they just knew that I could always pick myself up from things. But I was at this moment in my life where I was at a crossroads almost. I didn't know if I wanted to be alive or wanted to be dead. And via the Instagram algorithm, I found this lady called Emma Garrick, the anxiety whisperer, and I just called her on Saturday the 4th of June last year. And I just cried my eyes out when she picked up the phone. I begged her for that phone call. I just cried my absolute eyes out. And I said to her, am I a rapist? Am I gay? Am I suicidal? She said, Shaun, you have OCD. I was like, how do you know? She said, I have OCD too. I've got a lived experience of OCD. And she's a therapist, and she saved my life, to be very honest with you. And being in recovery, I was still worried that I was bipolar, schizophrenic. I was having all these fears. And I just woke up one day and I just quite literally just said to myself, fuck it. I'm going to go and change the world. And I went downstairs to my Google document on my laptop, opened it up, and I just started writing my story. That is quite literally how it started. And since then, it's shit has quote proverbially rolled upstream, but it wasn't the easiest, and that's the best way to describe OCD for people who don't understand it. So when people trivialize OCD, in some parts it's not their fault. It's, you know, the media's perception and what the media shows to be OCD, but it is genuinely a debilitating, crippling disorder, especially for those who have really severe OCD. I'm lucky, I'm privileged enough to be in recovery from OCD, whereas a lot of other people, they're tormented by their thoughts every single day.
Wow. I'm just like, wow. And I really hear there's a, you know, what we talked about earlier about being bold and stepping forward. There's also there in your story is like when you were struggling with your OCD and you didn't know what it was, you know, you really, you know, you searched for someone. You went to a therapist, it didn't necessarily help, but then you found the anxiety whisperer that really helped you. And it's what kind of percolate for me is there's this like piece of like masculinity, which I know you often speak about, and being strong. And also, you know, I'm not sure if you're familiar with something called the man box, which is a bunch of rules that often us men unconsciously live by. And like one of those rules for us often is to not be homosexual, right? So there's like this piece of like, should we call it toxic masculinity, that many men will be struggling with, like, oh, I have to be strong. I can't talk about how I feel, and I shouldn't be gay. And if they have OCD coupled with that, that could really crush them in their lives and what they're dealing with.
Absolutely. So in some instances, there's not enough research and evidence that proves that people that live with SO-OCD are necessarily homophobic. But in my individual case, I believe there's probably elements of internalized homophobia. If I was to have a very open and honest conversation, I grew up in a very conservative Christian household, Caribbean. And I grew up Seventh-day Adventist, which, to be very honest with you, it's a denomination of Christianity, but they'll never admit that. And it's a bit cult-like. They follow very close to Judaism in that sense. They don't eat shellfish, they don't eat pork, they only eat fish with scales. That's the best way to describe how I grew up. And there was an insidious idea and an insidious belief that to be gay was wrong. It was an illness and so much more. And we know that a lot of the Caribbean, a lot of our views are informed by Christian fundamentalism. And that was as a result of proselytization, so the forcing of conversion from one religion to another, which was what happened during colonization and slavery. But again, these are conversations that I think the Caribbean community often find quite difficult. And I'll give you an example. The first church was opened by Diego Columbus in Jamaica in 1504. So Diego Columbus was Christopher Columbus's son. Now there's more churches per square mile in Jamaica than there is anywhere else in the world. Now think about how small Jamaica is, right? There's more churches per square mile in Jamaica than anywhere else in the world. Christian fundamentalism has had a profound effect on the way we view gender identity, sexual identity, the way we view ourselves as men, the way we interact with other people in the world. So I believe there probably is elements of internalized homophobia. But for me also what it was a loss of my identity. The loss of what I believed I almost knew for certain, that the uprooting of my identity to this new identity, it just threw me completely out of whack. But you are right. If in the man box, we are taught to live in certain kind of ways. And there's a professor, Judith Stilton, who I spoke about in my TEDx talk, who speaks about men, we receive 4 different ways that we're taught how to be men when it comes to grief, which is stiff upper lip. We need to be strong, powerful. Strong, powerful loner stereotype, which means we need to handle our stuff at all times for ourselves. We cannot bother other people with any one of our issues. And we need to be self-reliant and self-sufficient. We need to always be there for other people, but not necessarily there for ourselves. And men, we're not born with inherent value. We're born with the value that we get from social status, what we give to society. So, for example, there's a reason why a lot of men, when they lose their job, they feel like their identity is absolutely crushed because they're no longer the provider, no longer the breadwinner. But when you look at the way society's moving with feminism and women having the right to go into the workplace, and the pill, which was a sexual revolution, really changed the way that women were able to interact with men. They had control over their organs and their body. All these different elements come into play as to why I believe men were having different conversations about masculinity, and ultimately my masculinity was massively informed by my upbringing. And I grew up in inner city London. I grew up with boys we all grew up in single parent households. A lot of the boys that I know have gone to prison. Some are dead. Some have gone to jail. That's the kind of environment I grew up in. I sound quite middle class to most people, but it's because my mum made me read a lot. I was forced to, every time I went out into school, coming back home was a very different world for me. So I was lucky and privileged to be able to have that environment compared to a lot of my other counterparts who weren't. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I can really hit, like something I've said often to men, to women, out in my message is like, as men, we receive the messaging from a very young age that our value is in what we do.
Absolutely.
And what we produce and what we create, not in who we are. So when we do lose a job, it's like that's a knock to our ability to produce. Or if we can't perform sexually, right, that's another thing. So many men who are feeling really downtrodden by society, who maybe they struggle to get education, they're struggling to get work, they're struggling to find a partner, they feel frustrated, they feel angry, and they're looking for someone else to blame, really, right? And there's some responsibility with themselves and some responsibility with other people, but this is what's kind of created this, the very negative conversations that some men are having around women and their place in the world, and the kind of anti-feminist feel that some men have, which I find interesting because I believe, maybe this isn't intrinsically said in feminism, but part of a lot of the conversation on feminism is to bring out the feminine in general energetically into the world, right? Which would release men from the belief that all they are is their production, because it would bring more emphasis to a man's character and who he is, and less about what he produces and what he creates.
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic point. Whenever I look at the movements that are happening in society, there's good and bad to be taken from it. I do believe a lot of the red pill community have some very fair points that they do make, that to be a man is quite hard. I think if you were to be honest, whether we're constrained by the lines of patriarchy and so much more, but I think the way we even view history can be quite... We can view history from the lens we want to read it from, not necessarily always the lens that it actually is, but history is written by the winners, right? So accountability and responsibility can be quite difficult when we're always looking for other people to blame. And when you're frustrated by society, it can be very hard to take on new ideas, to take on new concepts, and to look inward. But I understand and I hear a lot of men's frustration, and a lot of their feelings are valid and they are justified. For example, when we look statistically, a lot of people say that women are the most disadvantaged in the workplace. But if you're a short man, funnily enough, you actually are the most disadvantaged in the workplace. Most of the world's CEOs are 6 foot and above. Short men are not taken seriously. They're not taken seriously at all. And if you're a man who's not as good looking, you're quite low in the sexual hierarchy, you struggle to date, you're less likely to earn a lot of money. There's a lot of these conversations that people will not have. And you're right that bringing feminine energy into the world gives us some sort of inherent value, but it also gives us a place beyond the means of production and what we produce all of the time. And I've been guilty of it in the past, where I felt my value was only what I gave to the world, what I achieved, who I wanted to be, how much money I was going to make. And the more you look within, you realize I can make all the money in the world. I can make 100K a year, but it means nothing to me if I'm not happy within. And this is something I really try to speak about to a lot of people. And masculinity has many different tenets to it. There is not just one way to be a man. And one of my really good friends, Malcolm, he's taught me that himself. Him and I are very similar. We come from very similar worlds, but his masculinity is very different to my masculinity. And probably from him, I've seen that I can be a different kind of man. But a lot of men out there are struggling. And I believe with the mental health epidemic when it comes to men, especially, because I think suicide is the biggest killer of men under the age of 50. Men don't know their place in the world anymore. And men, we are taught, again, that we only have value by what we bring to the world. And I really want men to know that they have way more value than that. I know society may take time to catch up, but it's just something really important I want a lot of men to know. And this is why I speak openly about my mental health journey. I speak openly within the things that I do, because we need the right role models in certain places. I believe we have too many people in the world who don't add conducively to it, but rather add to this negative narrative.
And it's one of those, the thing I see more and more that's pervasive in our society now is polarization, right? But it's also that the people that shout loudest are the people that are almost the angriest, and they may be the most blaming of all, right? Like, you know, we see Andrew Tate, for instance, and he gets so much media attention, but someone who might be preaching a message of like love and connection and compassion and understanding really doesn't get the airtime, right? And it's almost like a perverse nature of our society and media setup, because I guess media is no longer an outlet for information and news to educate and help people. It is a business in of itself to make money and perpetuate narratives that enable them to sell more and to be more profitable.
Yeah, the media operates off a sensationalist model, which is a profit model, essentially. The more you can terrify people is the more you can sell to them, and the greater you can keep them in survivor mode. When it comes to people like Andrew Tate, I wouldn't say I hate him or love him. I think I try to take what he says with a pinch of salt, the same way I try to take some great other thinkers in the world who are female with a pinch of salt. And you're right, that polarization and division in the world is a big issue. But what people don't realize is the more and more you are divided is the less you can find that unifies you. And I believe all humans, ultimately, we have more in common than actually divides us. And finding a middle ground, yes, I believe there's some things fundamentally you're allowed to, believe. There's beliefs and morals and values you hold which you won't compromise on, and you're allowed to have that. But I believe we see people in such a dehumanizing way sometimes, which prevents us from seeing their genuine humanity. And I think when it comes to a lot of Andrew Tate followers, a lot of them are frustrated men in the world who want to lead the life that he leads, and they're looking up to somebody to almost give them the answers that they probably can't always find within themselves. But I'll use another example, Slumflower. I'm not sure if you've seen Slumflower. She created the Saggy Boobs Matter movement, and she just bashes men constantly. She does nothing more than bash men all the time. Her rhetoric and her career and her money is built off bashing men. And that does no good to the world either, because you take a lot of women who have been done hard by men, whether they've grown up with fathers not in their lives and they've struggled in romance, and you just lay them all at the feet and you blame the men. But the common denominator with all of this is us. We are the common denominator. If I go to the trash and I can't find a diamond, who am I supposed to be upset at the trash? I'm supposed to be upset at myself by looking into the trash, right? And we spoke about this. Accountability and responsibility are the only two things that we do have. We cannot control how we get down, but we can always control how we can get back up. And I think that's something that's really important. And it's not easy, but I really want people to understand that we can only blame people for as long as we want. You've got to go out there and make that change ultimately to the world. Like I didn't grow up in the most fortunate circumstances, and I'm an exception to the rule. I'm an outlier, but I want to give other people the chance and the opportunity to lead happy, happy, fulfilled, and most of all, purpose-driven lives. And I would like to believe that the work that I'm doing has that in the world. But why I call myself a professional agitator is because I speak about things that a lot of people are afraid to have conversations about. I speak about cancel culture, how I believe regardless if you're left wing or right wing, you're both sides of the same bird. We're all trying to travel to the same place, right? But cancel culture is not good for society if you're on the left or the right. Polarization prevents people from having certain conversations. And what happens when you can't have certain conversations? They get relegated to the underground. And in the underground, it festers, you sweep the dragon under the carpet, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where you can no longer ignore it. But by then, it has created an insurmountable amount of damage. And that's what I'm all about, damage limitation rather than, prevention is always better than cure. So if we can prevent people from going into the underground and getting into these radicalized spaces, that's what we need to be doing for the world.
And you do that by bringing conversations that may be uncomfortable for people to have into the light so that we can have the conversation in a way that is mature, a way that people can feel heard, but also that we do it in a way with a level of responsibility for ourselves and the people that are hearing that conversation.
Absolutely. And people do not realize just how important conversation is. Conversation shows us our shared humanity. I believe regardless where you are, our shared humanity means more than our political beliefs and opinions.
Amen, brother. Amen. I'm aware that the time is running away from us, and I feel like we could talk for hours across multiple different topics.
Listen,
here.
man, we can always do a part two if needs be.
Definitely. I love to round off the piece about OCD because, maybe some listeners are here and they're like, oh, when you described it there, it must be really deep in their own experience. And I'd love to hear what's really helped you in your recovery.
So I would say, first of all, by realizing I'm not the only one who goes through OCD. So when I first ever spoke about my story and I released it via the Book of Man, the platform that speaks about masculinity and mental health, I had so many people I knew in my personal life reach out to me and say, Shaun, I've got OCD too, which was like, wow, there was a community that I never knew existed. So as a result of that now, I've been able to create a WhatsApp group with over 30 Black people now speaking about OCD and our recovery, which doesn't sound like a lot to people, but it was a space that was needed. It was something that was heavily required by our community. So having a space where I can speak to people, I know that I'm not alone has been fantastic, but also writing my articles and speaking about it has been a very cathartic experience because it frees me from being a prisoner to my past and a prisoner to my OCD. Because what people don't realize is sharing a story really, it relieves the burden that often comes with holding in certain things. And that's one thing that's helped. I do gratitude journaling every single day. And my advocacy and activism really helps me to do a lot of the work and to show that I'm going to leave the world in a better place.
Yeah, no, that's really powerful because I think what's one of the things is that people often kind of want to avoid talking to anyone. And it's like, I think you said earlier, it's like when we talk about things, it makes it really lifts a load a lot, especially if we talk to a professional who is trained to listen, who knows how to hear what you're saying with compassion and love, and also to help you. And I imagine this is probably part of your process as well. Let me know if this is the case for you. It's like helping you question those thoughts, like help you be with those thoughts in a way that doesn't have you, so I say, spiraling around with them, but actually kind of stand on the outside and look at them and go, wait a minute, is this thought I'm having, is this mine? Where did it come from? Do I own this? Oh, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. So one thing I've learned to realize is, often you probably experience this even in your coaching practice, that we tell ourselves stories and we have incredibly limiting beliefs. And what happened with a lot of what I was going through was the more I hid it, was the more I believed the story that was happening in my head. And as I said, your brain creates stories. The same person that wrote Glee was the same person that wrote American Horror Story. And if people don't understand that reference, just type in the director who wrote in Glee and go and watch American Horror Story. And humans operate within dualities. We operate at usually two ends of the spectrum. I don't believe any human is inherently bad, and I don't believe any human is inherently good. I believe we have the propensity to be both, unless you're diagnosed psychopath or so much more. That's a whole nother conversation for another day. But what I realized was, when I was able to challenge the thoughts through therapy, and for OCD, you have to do a very specific kind of therapy, which is known as CBT-ERP, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure response prevention. And what that looks at doing is stopping yourself from keeping up the OCD cycle. Because when you stay in the OCD cycle, you stay questioning the thoughts, you stay believing the thoughts, you stay believing the ideas of what's going on in your head. When you stop that and you sit with the discomfort, you sit with the uncertainty, and you practice what we know as an ERP lifestyle, which is you get uncomfortable. You get comfortable with being uncomfortable. You handle uncertainty. And I believe the way that we're raised often in society is that we need everything to be definitive. But we don't know if the bus we're going to get on is going to be safe. We don't know if the train we're going to get on is going to crash, but we trust and believe the process for everything else except our own lives. And that's one of the core tenets I've been able to take away from the therapy that I've done and actually put into my own practice and with my own coaching. So that's the best way for me to describe the way I live now, but it's also one of the best ways for me to describe how I believe, in my opinion, that we should think about life. Don't believe every thought. Realize you tell yourself a story sometimes, which can be an incredibly limiting self-belief, and get comfortable with the uncomfortable.
It's a powerful way to live, because I think we've kind of groomed on this society that's become increasingly creating more and more comfort. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make ourselves more comfortable in our houses. They're warm. We want to shield ourselves from the rain. We want to shield ourselves from pain. And it's leaked into how we see life in general, but also how we do relationships as well. Like, a lot of people believe that they should be in relationships that are easy, whether that's family or romantic relationships. But actually, the comfort comes from, as you said, being able to sit with the discomfort and become comfortable with the feelings of discomfort, so that we can take action and move forward in our life in the way that we desire, while the discomfort or pain is also present.
Absolutely. And I'm not saying in any way, shape or form that pain is to be desired, but there's something called PTG, which is post-traumatic growth. Yes, what doesn't kill you does make you stronger, but obviously it does leave you traumatized at the same point, right? But you can work through that trauma. And what you learn is, when you grow through trauma, on the other side of it is a river to another side you've never ever been able to explore. If you stay within the places where you've been hurt the most and you only believe the stories that you tell yourself, you'll never be able to grow. And everybody in this world ultimately has the potential to grow. I know quite often there's a saying that old dogs can't learn new tricks, but old dogs can learn new tricks. It's just, obviously you know this from the neuroscience of our brain, but there's something called neuroplasticity, which is the ability to learn new behaviors, which is presented through neural pathways. And it can be hard for us to put in different practices to learn new habits. But a good example for me to use was when I started journaling, when I was in hospital with my pneumonia and I was suffering really badly with the OCD intrusive thoughts. When my friend brought me this journal and I went back home and I was suffering from insomnia badly for a couple of months as a result of being on antidepressants, which I'm luckily enough, again, privileged enough to be weaning myself off now. When I started writing in my journal, I thought, what is this nonsense? How on earth is this going to help me? But guess what? As time went on, a couple months later, my brain caught up. Your brain will always catch up. And when I would get to bed, my brain would be like, all right, cool. It's time for us to get into grateful mode. Or I'll be, I'm going to release all my struggles and my worries from the day. And we know that in CBT to be brain dumping. So from me practicing all this brain dumping, I was able to relieve myself of the burdens that were going on in my head. So your brain will always catch up. And I really just want people to know that hard times never last. They never last. They can't last. It's impossible for it to last. And when I thought I wasn't going to make it out on the other side, I'm really grateful to have the friends that I had. But I was also grateful to have people around me who refused to let me wallow in self-pity and depression. They told me, get up, you've got a world to change. And at the time, it wasn't the easiest. I wanted people to feel sorry for me, but by being accountable and responsible and helping myself, I was able to really get out of that. And everybody has the ability to do that. This is not some esoteric thing I'm saying. This is something that I believe we all have the ability and the potential to do.
Yes, we have that capacity. And quickly before we wrap up, because I know you mentioned it right towards the beginning of our recording, I'm interested in how the psychedelic therapy helped you as well.
Yeah, that's a conversation that we could really go into. So I enrolled onto a trial with Imperial College London looking into the therapeutic capabilities of psilocybin. And we know what psychedelics have done for years, and this is done with evidence via neuroimaging, MRIs, research, and so much more. Your default mode network in your brain is, David, if I ask you who you are, you're going to give me certain answers. Your default mode network comes into play. You'll answer and you'll say to me, I'm this and I'm that and I'm this and I'm that. What psychedelics does is it shuts down certain parts of that default mode network and fires up other parts of your brain that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to access in your everyday life. And it shows you different ideas. It can rebuild your neural pathways. And the best way to describe neural pathways is, imagine you stand on fresh snow, right? When you stand on the snow, you put footprints in. Your default med network, those are the answers you give. What mushrooms does is it resets the snow. It gives you a chance to explore different parts of yourself. Psychedelics in and of itself yes, are healing to a degree, but it is a stepping stone towards the other work you need to do. So for me, being in that therapeutic space, being around two therapists, I had to do integrative therapy, where you integrate what you learn on your psychedelic trip into your every other day part of life. Doing that was revolutionary for me. It really made me look inward of myself. And I remember when I was tripping, I had these chains that I was pulling out of me. And every time I wanted to run away from my emotions, I had this thought that said, you can't pass this level until you ask for what you really need. And I would hug the therapist and I would give them a kiss on the cheek, both of them, man and woman, sorry. And I was just like, wow, I really hide a lot of my emotions in an everyday life. So it was massive for me. And I believe the chain ultimately for me was a metaphor to let go of the emotional weight I carry. But funny enough, the therapist also believed it was the weight of slavery and colonization, and they weren't black themselves. You know, I never took into account any of their skin color because I was just in a space where I was grateful for help. So it really was very insightful, impactful, but also quite empowering to realize that I've got so much more to discover. That can be terrifying and also uniquely exciting at the very same point. But psychedelics are leading a massive mental health revolution. And a lot of our ideas in psychedelics come from Richard Nixon's War on Drugs, where we believe psychedelics are going to destroy the brain. And a lot of us have ideas that psychedelics are only what white liberal hippies take. But our cultures have been doing it for years. The world's oldest psychedelic, if I remember, is found in Africa, funnily enough. And these psychedelics that belong to certain when I say belong, I use the word that they are founded and guarded by certain civilizations, such as peyote, which is guarded by the Native Americans, and they refuse to let any other Westerner touch it. So psychedelics are really an exciting conversation. In my opinion, I say to people, it's very hard to explain psychedelics until you've tried it. But as a caveat, having a psychedelic trip around people that love and care about you has a massive impact into the way you experience yourself on psychedelics.
Incredible, brother. And it's a big conversation and there's so much depth there, but really having your experience there is beautiful to hear because it's had such a profound impact on you. But I'm also aware that time is running away from us. So I'm sure the listeners are wondering where they can listen to more of your talks, where they can find your podcast, where they can, be more in contact with you and the amazing work that you're doing.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll send you all my details in a show note as well, so you can put it in your show notes so people can access it in the description. But if you want to find me, my name's Shaun Flores, so ShaunFlores. Flores, yeah. On all social media, you can find me everywhere. My DMs are open. I'm happy to chat and talk to people. I really try to give my time as much as I can to people. Sometimes it can be quite exhausting, but I'm open to conversation, and you can find me anywhere. You can find my articles, my TED Talks on the internet. I have a strong digital receipt, so to not find me, I would be shocked at myself too. But I'm open. I'm happy to talk to anyone, even if we agree or we disagree. You want to tell me you don't agree with something, let's have a conversation. So you can find me, on all social media at the Shaun Flores, TheShaunFlores.
Incredible. Thank you for your time and your wisdom and your really profound lived experience. I'm sure I'm eternally grateful for this conversation. I'm sure the listeners are as well.